If you were here a little while ago, I was starting a video about George Floyd, Rene Girard's theory of the founding murder, and why we have reached the point of no return. But the Facebook gremlins and the internet conspired, and the video got stuck. So I'm back again, just really kind of touching in on this idea. And it's funny because in this video, there's actually a link to a sermon that I gave last weekend. And that sermon touches on this idea a little bit, and it gets into the last words of George Floyd as well as the last words of Elijah McClain, and how love transcends the worst thing that we've ever done or the worst thing that's ever happened to us. And that somehow there's this spiritual awareness that exists with us at all times. We don't pay attention to it very frequently because of our own entanglements. Sorry for that word, but our own entanglements, so we miss it a lot. And it's funny that the last video got disrupted because I think that sometimes these disruptions come to help us to focus and to pay a little bit more attention to what we're saying and what we're putting out there. If you're not familiar with Rene Girard or that concept of the founding murder or his work on scapegoating, he was an anthropological philosopher who basically looked at the scope of humanity throughout history and saw that myths and cultures and all these things could always get pointed back to a founding murder. That someone died, and then when that person died, something happened in the culture that shifted, and people can look at when their new beginning happened based on somebody's death. And I learned about it from one of my professors in seminary, Mark Heim. And if you went to Andover Newton Theological School and you studied with Dr. Heim, this will sound familiar to you. But ever since I learned about the founding murder theory, I've been wondering when the next founding murder will be. Because as we all know, our country and most of our world tries to portray itself as just, benevolent, and different things like that. But those of us who pay attention know that that's not the case. It's an ideal that we set before us, something that we aspire to, but that a lot of times our most base human instincts actually prevent us from living into the ideals that we proclaim. So we'll say that we're one way, but then when the chips are down or we're under pressure, we act in a completely different way. We also tend to think that we're more evolved than we might be. And Rene Girard's work kind of points that out. And when we see things like what happened with George Floyd, it's a mirror. It shows us our own faces. And one of the things that Dr. Heim taught and that Rene Girard taught was that with Christianity, it was basically a mirror too. That it followed along the same trajectory as many myths. That a new culture was emerged from a death, but the difference between that story and a lot of the other ones is that this time it was told from the point of view of the victim rather than the point of view of the victor. And usually when we look at history, it's the victor who writes the history. That's why right now so many things are coming out about the history of the United States that most people don't know. They're surprised by it. I mean, people who went through it aren't surprised by it, or people who've taken the time to dig deep aren't surprised by it. But a lot of people are surprised because if the victor writes the history, they're going to write a version of history that looks most like them, and it keeps them in the highest light possible. But because of the dam breaking with the murder of George Floyd, it's very similar to the founding murder that was talked about in Christianity, where the point of view of the victim is incorporated in the story. And so we see, because we have video of what happened to George Floyd, that no matter what stories people try to tell about George Floyd as a person, whether they say he's a good guy or a bad guy, or whatever kind of things that people want to make up or say, it doesn't matter, because the video and the injustice that was displayed in the video over that length of time is enough to hold a mirror up to people in society that then enables us. It's not, some of it is not so much of people, from my perspective, it's not so much of people saying this is yes, it's a tragedy what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain, and the names go on and on. But really, what I think is raging people, so a lot of people, is what those murders say about us. That we live in a society where we say one thing and do another thing, and now we're faced with that. And so that video is holding a mirror to our faces, and we don't like what we're seeing, and we're trying to get that energy off of us, and we're trying to express it in some kind of way to say, no, like I don't, I want to be a part of whatever direction you end up leaning based off of having this projection coming back at us through looking at this video. And the reason why I say that there's no going back is because now that George Floyd's video is out there, it's excruciating. There's still people that haven't watched it that are still, outraged because of what they heard about it. But now that it's actually, in our society and it's a part of it, the reason why it had the global impact that it did is because injustice has been global all along. And it's like it's starting to burst out of people. And people who would be historically seen as victims are saying, we have stories to tell too. We have injustices that we've endured. And the more that people start to put their stories out there and share their experiences, the less we can hold that former structure, that structure of what some people might try to call civility, false civility, because it's based on keeping other people suppressed or treating other people as scapegoats. It's more difficult to do that now. And so now our culture and our society has to reshape itself in order to make room for a larger narrative. And that's why we can't go back. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can look at the link that's inside of the description of this video. I also offer up that sermon where I talk a little bit about Rene Girard and the concept of scapegoating, and also how I think the next evolution in human consciousness is actually walking the walk. And to be able to walk the walk when you've just been talking about the walk for a long time is a big leap. But what will enable us to do that is to make contact with whatever is emerging in us when we think about these things that are happening in the world, and to decide that we're going to live that love. Right now, for a lot of us, we'll put a lot of things on hold until we're forced to do something different. But if we can just kind of touch base with that way that we show up after we've been forced, and hold on to that and commit to that and live that in our daily lives, then we won't need things like a founding murder or a scapegoat to propel us forward as a society, as a culture. And even though it may seem bleak right now, I do think that that many of us are developing that capacity. We're doing that through engagement, through reading, through learning, and then we have to put it into application. That means that when we go out into the world, we have to really look at ourselves and see and call ourselves out when we're being full of crap, which is hard to do because we like to present a show that we are the person that we imagine ourselves to be when we're sitting in a room by ourselves. But then when we hit the real world, we get to see how we really are. And once we start to really care about being who we say we are instead of appearing to be how we say we are, we'll make those changes. And this experience with George Floyd, and not just George Floyd, I mean, obviously, there's been so many others. But the reason why, I said before, the reason why the dam broke with him is because we can visually look at the victim's story, and it's changing us. And it's changing us on fundamental ways. Even the people who are seemingly resistant, it's because of what they fear they have to lose by hearing more of the story. It's not necessarily that they're actively resisting because of the changes that will be required in order for them to be able to hold that story. And we can shame them or whatever the case may be, but the fact is that as a society, we've been doing that for a long time. And so I think it's really incumbent upon each and every one of us as individuals to look at ourselves before we even, as the Bible says, get that log out of your eye before you tell there's somebody there's a speck in theirs, and just live into this awareness. Because if we allow this to just kind of go back to try to get back to where it used to be, which is never going back. But if we even try to get it go back, it's going to take something even worse to wake us up. And I don't think anybody wants that. 2020 has been hard enough. So at any rate, I hope that you get something out of this video and a little bit of the concepts that I lifted up. Um, I guess one more thing I want to say before we go. If you look at the link, you'll see this information a little bit. I write a little bit about it, and there's a sermon underneath what I wrote that expounds on some of this. But if you don't bother to go to the link and watch the video or read the little piece that I wrote, I want you to think about this. You know, a lot of times we look back on people in history and we look at them and we say, man, how unevolved they were. And we think that we're better than them. And I invite us to not do that, because what it does is it gives us a distorted perception and it makes us not really be witnesses to what's happening. And the thing that I lift up in the post that I wrote is that we look back on people a long time ago who used to do like these animal sacrifices and all this other stuff to the gods and all these other things. And we thought like, oh, well, at least we're not doing stuff like that. And I submit to you that we are continuing to do that. We have always been doing that. Anytime we see people who are sacrificed to the prison system, sacrificed for the economy, sacrificed for popularity and fame, or just like trolled in certain ways or whatever, we are doing that because we have not yet spiritually evolved to not need other people to put our negative energy on. So my invitation to you and a reflection back to myself is to not do that. If you find yourself feeling negative energy, try to develop some kind of practice to displace that, learn from it, and then transform it and do something good with it. Meditate, reflect, journal, do something, because every time we feel a negative energy on ourselves and then we try to get that negative energy off of us by putting it on someone else, we are enacting scapegoating mechanisms and sacrificial mechanisms of other people. And the world doesn't need it. It needs us to clean up what's in here so that we can then, oh, I see my friends saying, yeah, some are actively resisting. Yes, they're actively resisting. I'm gonna speak to that for a second. Some people are actively resisting because they have been lied to just as much as any one of the rest of us. I don't want to make a whole, I might have to make a whole separate video about this, but active resistance is normal. If you have children and your child is like, say they're watching a television show, and then you tell them, you know what, you watch a little bit too much television. It's time for you to stop watching television. It's time for you to read a book. The kid's gonna run away and try to actively resist. That's a part of the process. It's up to the person with the most maturity or the more awakened, unfortunately, to be able to say, "Hey, things are changing, and I'm gonna walk with you through this change." If you actively resist, yeah, that's normal, but there's no way to we can't use that same paradigm against other people, because just like Einstein said, you can't use the same idea to mind that got you in a situation to get you out of it. In order for us to create a better system, a better community that can actually help us heal and become the people that we know we can be, we actually have to make room for the people in the world who don't want to make room for us. And that means that we have to purify in our own inner being how we show up in the world and to live into the fullness of our professions so that they see how it's done. Right now, most of us are hypocrites. And there's a couple of types of hypocrites that you can be. One type of hypocrite is the person who says one thing and does another thing because they are concerned of how they look to other people. And then the other type of hypocrite is the person who says one thing and does another thing as they're learning. So it's better to be the better kind of hypocrite, and then hopefully live into a place where you're no longer a hypocrite and you're actually being the things that you profess. And then when people encounter people being the things that they profess, it has a transformative quality on them. And obviously, many of us fall on a day-to-day basis. But the thing is to just kind of get up, try if that's your calling, and not to make excuses for ourselves when we play into that, but to just continually live into what we profess, and just go from there. We can't control anybody else. The only thing we can do is control ourselves, but we can invite people into greater possibilities. But first, we have to demonstrate those possibilities. Because if they're acting out of fear of loss and all these other things, and then we respond with greater fear of loss, no one actually gains. So that's the proposition that I'm offering up to that question. At the end of the day, stop sacrificing people. Stop sacrificing yourself. You're a beautiful creature. You were created by a loving creator. There's something spectacular that you can bring into the world, but you have to be able to get present, be still with yourself, and be a witness to how you're shaping the world that you're a part of. So that's it for now. I have some other ideas about Rene, Girard, and things that I probably will share in the future. And I hope you get something out of this. If it does speak to you, I invite you to share it to other people, mostly so we can have some deeper conversations and not get stuck in the patterns that have been running for thousands and thousands of years. We have the opportunity to change the story, and to invite more people in and to create a world where there's plenty of room for human compatibility. So I hope you feel like being a part of that.